So good afternoon, everyone. Again, thank you all for joining today's webinar. My name is William Moore, and I am with OJJDP's National Training and Technical Assistance Center. And as your technical host, I would like to go over and take a couple of minutes to discuss a few features within Adobe Connect on our platform and provide a few announcements for everyone to keep in mind. Please note that this event is indeed being recorded and will be published on OJJDP's NTTAC's YouTube page. The webinar recording will be archived in approximately 1 week on OJJDP's NTTAC YouTube channel. You can also view past webinars on the channel as well. For the event transcript or any supporting materials, please contact OJJDP's NTTA Help Desk. For those wishing to download a copy of the PowerPoint slides and other important documents, you may do so by locating the handouts pod directly above the chat area. Here you will also be able to find an FAQ for webinar participants that will likely address any technical related questions. Click on the name of the file and then click the download button. At the end of today's webinar, there will be a Q&A session where the presenters will address some of the questions posed during the presentation. Please type your questions into the chat box as they arise. For those of you participating in today's webinar as a group, please take a minute to help us count. Go to the chat window and type in the total number of additional people in the room with you today. If you are viewing alone, there is no need to type anything into the chat pod at this time. So please only include any additional people that are joining you today. And I'll give everyone just a few minutes to go ahead and do that. Thank you. At the conclusion of today's webinar, you will be provided with a link to a brief survey about today's presentation. The feedback you provide is used to help assist with future webinar planning and training. And following today's webinars, attendees will be sent a certificate of attendance. This certificate is sent approximately 1 hour following the conclusion of the event and is sent via an Adobe Connect Thank You email. Please keep an eye out for your email for this certificate. I will now turn it over to Elizabeth Wolf, the Training and Outreach Coordinator for the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, to provide us with a welcome for today.
Thank you, William. Hi, this is Elizabeth Wolf, and as he said, I'm the Training and Outreach Coordinator for the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. On behalf of OJJDP, I'd like to welcome all of you to today's webinar. I'm so pleased by the numbers that are signed up and participating today. This is the first of a two-part series entitled Averting School Violence, Learning Lessons from the School Attack That Didn't Happen. I am pleased to welcome our presenters from the Police Foundation, who will be providing an overview of the Averting School Violence Database and Project. They were kind enough to come into our office and do this presentation for our staff. It was so good we wanted to share with everyone else. The presenters will discuss the training provided in schools to help identify behavior that can lead to violence. Again, I'd like to thank you for joining us, and I look forward to the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Elizabeth. I will now turn over the presentation for today's presentation to Frank Straub, who will give us an introduction of the presenters. Frank?
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining this very important webcam discussing the Averted School Violence Database. I am the Director of Strategic Studies at the Police Foundation, as well as the Director of the Center for Mass Violence Response Studies. Incidents of school violence and other mass violent events are unfortunately occurring in greater frequency and greater lethality. We believe that there is much to be learned by studying these events, both the completed events and those that were averted. Recently, I had a conversation with an emergency room director in Broward County. As you may or may not know, the Police Foundation is doing an after-action review of the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School incident. And during our conversation, the ER director said that he believed it was very important that we institutionalize the study of mass violence events and school shootings specifically. He believes that by institutionalizing the study of these events, we have the opportunity to build the body of knowledge and to learn constructive lessons to inform our practices, both from a prevention, a response, and a recovery perspective. Unfortunately, as the doctor noted, these events seem to be continuing. And as I noted originally, increasing in both violence, and lethality, and frequency. Why is studying violent events, averted school violent events, so important? Well, we believe, fortunately, that averted school events happen much more frequently than completed events. And so there's a greater body of incidents to study and to learn from. Also, by looking at averted events, we really have an opportunity to develop opportunities to prevent and prepare for these events. At the end of the day, we need to stop these events from occurring. Once the violence has started, the damage is done. Damage that will live and scar forever our victims, the families of victims, our first responders, and communities. And so we really need to focus on the prevention and the preparedness for these events. ASV creates an opportunity to gather and analyze data on averted and completed school violence to inform public safety, school administrators, policymakers, research professionals, other government officials, and private sector security and safety experts. I would like to acknowledge and thank the National Institute of Justice and the COPS Office for providing funding to the Averted School Violence Project, to OJJDP for supporting the webinar and our partner ICF. Today's participants also share incredible amounts of expertise in the area of school violence, as well as my team members, Sarah Solano and Dean Esserman, and today's participants, Lauren Alfred from the Sandy Hook Promise, and Dr. Peter Lightman, an expert on school shooters. And with that, I'll turn the mic over and the presentation over to Sarah Solano from the Police Foundation. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Frank. I appreciate that. So for everyone's background, I'm just going to give kind of an overview of how our Averted School Violence database began, a little bit of the background of why it was created, and some of the concepts upon which it was founded. So as Frank mentioned, this was an initiative that was funded by the National Institute of Justice and the COPS Office. And we saw it as really addressing a gap in study on averted attacks in schools. So we've heard from practitioners, we've heard from open sources and other information that these averted attacks occur with much greater frequency than those attacks that actually come to fruition. So the idea is that there's a lot to be learned with these averted attacks and that they should be studied in a systematic and national way, which was part of the reason why this initiative was created. And it's really founded on the concept of something called near miss, which is really just saying that there are more averted attacks than completed attacks in the situation of schools. Now, this near miss concept is something that's been institutionalized by the aviation industry. So they study on a really comprehensive and large-scale basis any plane crashes that have been successfully averted from occurring. So they do this, they collect information. If there was, a plane crash that almost happened, they identify the lessons learned of what almost went wrong, and then they share that information back with the pilots and the crew and with others so that future plane crashes don't happen. So this is obviously a very useful procedure, and we thought that it had some applicability in the school setting as well, and that's really what this is founded upon. Now, the ASV database today, it looks a little bit different than it did when we started a few years ago. So at this point, it is a national level and comprehensive information sharing platform that can be accessed at asvnearmiss.org. And it really does a couple of key things. So if you are, say, for example, a teacher that played a direct role in preventing an act of violence at your school, through our website, through this asvnearmiss.org URL, you can share your story of how you played a role in preventing that attack. You can provide your takeaways on the response and other information that can essentially aid other practitioners to help prevent something similar from happening at their school. So that's really the first part of our ASV system. The second part is, again, that same teacher, if they wanted to see or hear about other stories of averted violence across the country, they could again go into this ASV Near Miss platform and they can take a look at stories that were shared by other practitioners across the country on averted school violence as well. And this is a resource that it's really important to mention as well that it's completely free. So it's for law enforcement, it's for school personnel, it's for mental health professionals, really anyone who can play a direct role in identifying and preventing acts of violence in schools. And just to reiterate, really the underlying goal and concept here is to collect and analyze this data on averted school attacks in order to figure out what is working and what is going well that's allowing the majority of these incidents to be averted. So by increasing the body of knowledge in that area, the hope and obviously the goal is to prevent future acts of violence from occurring in schools. In terms of the definition that we use for an averted attack for our system, it's pretty straightforward, but we try to keep it broad. So really the main thing to emphasize here is that we don't just limit our data collection efforts to school shootings. So if there was an attack planned at a school with an explosive or with a knife or another type of weapon, we think that information is still valuable to analyze and to learn from. So we would welcome reports on those types of incidents as well. And again, to give you a little bit more of an idea of what this ASV system looks like, we've included a photo of what our database looks like on the front end. So if you're able to see, there are a couple of different tabs in that little blue section at the top. So you can submit a report, you can browse reports, so you can take a look at the stories that other practitioners across the country have shared about averted violence in their schools, and you can do a couple of other things on this system. But again, really the important thing here is sharing the stories in the first place. So we leave this open to anyone who is involved in an averted attack at a school. I'll go back to the example of the teacher, but it could also be a school administrator, it could be the law enforcement officer, or the school counselor. We want to hear your story, anything that was valuable that you learned from how the attack was prevented, we want to learn that here. And we also allow you to share your story anonymously if that is desired. We don't necessarily find it important to share or ask for those identifying information, such as the name of the school or your name and information. So we really just want to focus on the facts of these incidents and then the takeaways that you learned. In the image that you see right now on the submitter report, that little block, it contains the main headings that we have of sections of information that we collect into our system. So you'll see there will be some questions about information on the school, as well as how the attack was averted in terms of, you know, who was the first person to identify it, what was the prevention looking like, in addition to some other questions as well. And then really what's unique about this is at the end in that little block that's called assessment, that's where we really want to hear from you as, for example, again, the teacher that played a role in preventing this incident. We want to hear what you thought went well in terms of attack prevention. Maybe your school recently implemented a new safety procedure or an anonymous tip line. Maybe that directly led to the identification of the incident. We really just want to hear your takeaways and what you thought was successful when the attack was prevented. After that, after you would submit the form, we as the Police Foundation receive it back from you essentially in a back-end system. What we do at that point is, along with a subject matter expert, we review the report for authenticity, for any additional lessons learned, and then most importantly, we remove any identifying information. So if there were any names provided in the report, we take all of that out before sharing it back onto our website, which at that point, if you can see where the arrow is pointing on the photo, we republish the report back into our ASB website. And that's essentially where you can go back, you can take a look at the facts of the incident, and then you can kind of see the takeaways that the person who shared the story had. And something important to mention about this particular section of our ASB website, again, where the arrow is pointing, this is a section that requires vetting. So as just kind of another layer of security for anonymity and for comfort, only those who are directly involved in school safety, such as a law enforcement officer, someone at the school, a mental health professional, someone who's a threat assessment or risk mitigation professional, only those types of individuals are vetted and allowed to view the incident level report library, as you can see here. And I just covered one way that information can come into our system. So that is from that teacher that averted an attack at their school. They go in, they share their information, we publish it back out for other practitioners to view. So that's just one way we receive information. Another way that we do this, and what we've kind of done so far as Police Foundation, is we've proactively identified open source reports of averted school violence using media or other court documents as they're available, in addition to any stories or reports from our subject matter experts. So there's a combination of different types of reports in our system. But really the most important and the most valuable ones, and really the ones that we're trying to move towards in the future, are the reports that are directly submitted by the person who played a role in preventing the violent attack, which is going to go ahead and lead me into our first series of poll questions. So I'm going to go ahead and read these out, and then they'll be displayed on your screen shortly after. So first and foremost, has anyone in the audience been involved in preventing an act of violence at your school? If so, would you be willing to share information about the incident and your takeaways on how it was successfully prevented at asbnearmiss.org? And then finally, if you are willing to share your report, the poll questions, while you're still finishing up, I'll just go ahead and share that if you responded yes to any of these questions, first and foremost, thank you for your willingness to share your story, and secondly, that we will be following up with you after the webinar with some additional information in related to those responses. So much appreciated. Thank you. So at this point, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Peter Lightman to discuss some of our initial findings from a preliminary analysis that we did through our ASB project.
Okay, thank you. This is Dr. Peter Langman. Good afternoon, everyone. Just to highlight what we'll be taking a look at, there's not only a database of averted school violence incidents, but a companion database of school attacks that did occur. So we will be looking at some data from both of those collections. Keep in mind, there's a lot of data, a lot of recommendations that came out of these databases. We're just going to have time to take a look at a few highlights. And also keep in mind that each database that was analyzed contained 51 incidents. This is not a complete tally of every incident of school violence or averted school violence, but they are rather robust samples. We asked a lot of questions relating to school information in terms of what safety and security processes they had in place, as well as information relating to the school itself, its geographical location and size, trying to get a sense of where these incidents were occurring, whether they were actual incidents or averted incidents. In regards to safety and security measures, a lot of that data was not available, keeping in mind that we're going back to incidents as far back as over 15 years ago, anything post-Columbine. So finding out what procedures were in place, what staff a particular school had, years back was not always possible, but we did as much as we could to collect comprehensive information. And that leads us to another question. Has your school made improvements or enhancements in the last 2 years in any way related to school safety and security? So you have another poll question here to participate in.
All right, thank you for completing the poll. We can go ahead and move along to the next slide.
Okay, thank you everyone for your participation in the poll. Okay, other information that we studied in the databases was, related to the perpetrator or potential perpetrator's attack plan, what was being planned, what weapons were intending to be used, and most importantly, how the attack was prevented. Who discovered it, who was aware of information, where was that information passed along to, and so on. We also tried to get a sense of who the perpetrator or potential perpetrator was in terms of personal history, behavioral issues, family history, any motivations that were made apparent, and so on, to try to flesh out our understanding of what was driving the violence or the intended violence. So first we're going to take a quick look at some information from the averted attacks. And looking at where they occurred in terms of elementary school, middle school, high school, and college or university, as you can see on the slide, the overwhelming number of averted attacks occurred in high schools. And that may simply be a matter of most attacks are being planned in high schools, but we're going to see some interesting differences when we look at the actual attacks in terms of where they occurred. But for the 51 averted incidents, close to 70% were planned to occur in a high school setting. And when we look at the information related to, when it was reported and how quickly someone was arrested, the arrest tended to happen very quickly. Once the potential plot was discovered, in many cases, the student was arrested the same day. Other cases, it took a little longer, but based on this, it looks like when there is clear information available, law enforcement has been very responsive. Now, how was the plan discovered? In many cases, students simply talked about it. In some cases, they posted things on social media, various writings. There were multiple ways that the plot was discovered. And in some cases, multiple people came across different types of evidence for the same plot. And when multiple people reported, that just made the concern that much higher and perhaps resulted in a quick response, because it was not just one person's report, but multiple people coming forward with concerns about the same student. In terms of who most frequently discovered the plan, it was most often, other students. In other words, classmates, friends of the student in question were far and away more likely to know about the plot than anybody else. And that just really highlights the importance of educating students about the warning signs of violence, making sure they know what to do, how to report it, where to turn, and so on when they do have safety concerns, because far and away the students are more likely than anyone else to pick up on the warning signs. However, as you can see, school personnel also discovered some of the plots, parents and other people in the community. So what this really highlights is the importance of educating not just the students, and not just the students and staff, but entire communities about warning signs and what to do when they have a concern, whom they should be contacting, and so on, because really this is a community effort to keep people safe. Now, interestingly, almost 60% of the attacks were just single people planning an act of violence. That means over 40% had 2 or more perpetrators involved. And that's very interesting. Again, that will be very different when we see the actual attacks. So over 40% of the attacks had 2, 3, 4, in some cases 5 or 6 people planning the attack. And what that possibly suggests is that when there's more people involved, it's more likely that someone will discover the attack, that there's more people talking about it, and that makes it more likely that the plot will be discovered. So that's a quick overview of a few findings from the Averted database. Now we're going to take a look at the database of actual attacks that did occur. And in comparison, whereas 11.8% of the averted attacks took place in college or university settings, nearly 40% of the actual attacks took place in higher education. And we don't know why that is, but one possibility is that adults are better at covering their tracks, that it's harder, perhaps, to detect an attack being planned by an adult, whereas the juvenile perpetrators perhaps talk more and are less careful about revealing their intentions. And interestingly, all 51 actual attacks were carried out by a single individual. And as I just said, for the averted attacks, over 40% had 2 or more people involved. And that may be why they were averted, that there was more opportunity for picking up on the warning signs. And when we look at the relationship between the perpetrators of the attack and their schools, overwhelmingly they are current students committing the attacks, sometimes former students. It's much less common that there is a stranger to the school who comes in and commits an attack. So for the most part, what we are seeing is that whether it's averted attacks or actual attacks, they're being planned by current students. And that has implications for safety. If the primary focus on safety is keeping intruders outside of the building, that is maybe missing the point that most of the perpetrators actually belong in the building because they are current students there. So safety has to focus not just on keeping out people who don't belong in the school, but identifying members of the school community who may be posing a risk. And when we look at the ages of both the perpetrators and the potential perpetrators, most of them are falling in the 15 to 19-year-old range. So when we look at the actual perpetrators, there's a high number also who are 28 and older. As I said, a significant number of the attacks did occur at colleges and universities. We're seeing older people committing those attacks than we see in the averted incidents. So just some brief takeaways from the data. Now, the key thing to highlight is that we need to educate students and teachers about the warning signs. Clearly, when people have seen warning signs and reported them, dozens of attacks have been prevented. Unfortunately, when we look at those attacks that were not prevented, in many cases there were warning signs, whether among the students or the school staff. In many cases, people did see things that in hindsight were warning signs, but they did not identify them as such ahead of time. So we really need to educate everyone in the school community about warning signs and how to report them, whom to turn to when they have a safety concern. And that means also that we need our schools to have threat assessment teams in-house, whether within each school or within a district. And by having a threat assessment team on site, we can better respond to safety concerns that are brought forward. That brings us to another poll question. Does your school have a threat assessment team?
Okay, thank you all for providing answers to the poll questions. Peter, we can go ahead and move on.
Okay. Okay, another takeaway is the fact that simply being proactive about safety can make a difference. One school that had an averted attack had the idea to simply ask students if anyone they knew in the school presented any safety concerns with them. And based on the student reports, 3 additional plots for potential violence were discovered. Law enforcement got involved, and potentially further lives were saved. So simply asking students the question about any safety concerns they have could save people's lives. When it comes to law enforcement, just a couple of points as well. You know, in a number of cases, there were school shootings that turned into hostage situations. Even if there were no hostages, in some cases, the perpetrators had chained doors shut. And this highlights the need for law enforcement to have door breaching equipment so they can get in and stop the attack as soon as possible. Similarly, it was highlighted that local schools should be working closely with the local law enforcement. They should have the police come in and do walkthroughs so they're familiar with the building. The police departments should have floor plans of all the schools. The greater the familiarity the police have with the school, the better they can respond if there is an emergency. And that brings us along to Lauren, who will tell us about Sandy Hook Promise.
Thank you all. It's great to be here with you, and special thanks to OJJDP, lots of consonants, OJJDP and the Police Foundation for inviting Sandy Hook Promise to be a part of this webinar. We have really appreciated our partnership with the Police Foundation and are so grateful for their leadership and work on the Averted School Violence Project. Sandy Hook Promise was founded by several of the family members who lost their loved ones in the shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School in 2012. And they really set out following that shooting to create an organization and a legacy for their children that was all focused on prevention And to do that, they really identified a gap in prevention programming that was available to schools and students at a community level that was evidence-based and that was no cost. There are a lot of programs out there that work around the areas of school safety, but the real gap that they saw was in the area of knowing the signs and identifying warning signs of violence before violence occurred. And so that really became our focus, and what we did was to focus on how we prevent violence before it happens by creating a culture of engaged youth and adults. The idea being that in so many of these shootings, from Sandy Hook to Parkland to Columbine to Sutherland Springs and Virginia Tech, that all of these shooters are showing warning signs before the violent act occurs. That in so many of these cases, and in 80% of school shootings, the shooter tells someone before they complete the shooting. In 70% of youth suicides in our schools, the young person is telling someone, telling a peer of their plans to hurt themselves. And all of that represented an opportunity to intervene earlier and to help put those dots together to save lives. And that is what we're working to do. We also work on the area of access to firearms and safety with the goal of ensuring safe storage and trying to limit the means to hurt yourself or others in moments of crisis. So as I said, there are always warning signs that these violent acts are going to occur. And so we have a responsibility and an opportunity to get ahead of it and to really focus on the school ecosystem in our work to keep students safe. And so as we learned more and more, and as our families really faced the reality that in the case of shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary, the FBI said it was preventable. And so we wanted to dig in on the kinds of prevention programming that we could bring to schools that would get ahead of violence and really dive into those precursors of violence to stop suicide and mass violence before it occurred. So as I said, there are always warning signs, but we do like to emphasize when we talk about school safety and when we're on webinars like this, that by and large, schools are safe. And that's really important to keep in mind right now, as a lot of attention has gone to reactive and approaches and kind of short-term solutions, is that schools are safe, but we know that they're not immune to these threats, and that's why we have to do something about it. So how we do it is through our 4 of the Signs programs. Our first program is Start with Hello, and Start with Hello focuses on social isolation and how we prevent it. It trains students to recognize the warning signs of social isolation and how to reach out to one another and create connectivity within their school community to improve climate, to reduce bullying, and to really create a generation of youth who have friends and connected networks within their school. Everything from No One Eats Alone to No One Plays Alone, these activities help to sustain the Start with Hello concept throughout the school year, but it really begins by challenging youth to be a part of the solution and to make sure that when they're seeing peers who are isolated, that they are reaching out, and it gives them the role playing and the tools to do just that. And we've seen phenomenal results with that program. Our second program is Signs of Suicide, which is the only evidence-based peer-to-peer suicide prevention program in the country. And it really focuses on training youth and adults to know the warning signs of suicide and self-harm and how to get help. It aims to improve help-seeking behavior in both the students themselves as well as help-seeking behavior for peers. So they're identifying those warning signs through a self-assessment. So we see a fair amount of self-reporting through this training, as well as reporting about peers who might be at risk of hurting themselves. Our Say Something program is our flagship program and is all focused around that concept that I talked about all of the warning signs and signals that are there in these shootings and acts of violence within schools. And Say Something really trains students to know the warning signs of violence and to act to report it to a trusted adult, and to get help. Understanding that 37% of these threats of violence are being reported through social media, and that the reality is students are our eyes and ears in schools. They're going to be the first ones to know when something is going to happen and when there's a threat to the school or to their peers. And so they have to be engaged as part of that solution, and Say Something trains them to do that. Start with Hello, SOS, and Say Something are all deliverable in under 40 minutes through classroom or large assembly presentations. And both Say Something and Start with Hello are available for free digital download through EverFi, so that they can be sent home as homework or an after-school assignment, and can be done throughout the school year without limitations of classroom time or teacher time. And our last program is Safety Assessment and Intervention, which is a school threat assessment program that really builds off of the fact that school threat assessment is the #1 recommendation we hear after every school shooting, is that each team within a school who handles disciplinary threats and actions needs to be trained in threat assessment. They need to know how to intake threats, but also triage and help intervene to get students connected to services and supports that can keep them in school, that can stop a pathway of violence, and can really ensure that we're getting ahead of self-harm and violent behavior towards others before it escalates into crisis. And so we train in partnership with Dr. Dewey Cornell, teams within schools, and have trained large school districts throughout the country to put these teams in place. And it's improved both reporting and triage of information that has allowed us to stop multiple school shootings and multiple suicides. We deliver all of this training both in person through our Promise Presenter trainers, who are trained in the evidence-based programming and to deliver it with fidelity. As I said, we also offer these programs through digital download and interactive training videos that maintain the fidelity of the programming. Our programming is available in English and Spanish with multilingual presenters who can speak the language of the students that they're presenting to. And we sustain all of this programming through our Save Promise clubs, which are youth clubs that can be established in any school around the country, and that we support through our school outreach coordinators and through our student and school staff as part of Sandy Hook Promise. And these clubs are not only bringing the programs to their schools, but also continuing that education throughout the school year. As I spoke about before, through our Say Something and threat assessment training, we have seen multiple school shootings, suicide, and gun threats stopped. We have trained in total 3.5 million students and adults throughout the country in over 7,000 schools, and we're continuing to grow. And our programs like Start with Hello, SOS, and Say Something have helped to stop and reduce cutting, bullying, eating disorders, and all forms of violence that are disrupting our schools and threatening the safety and health of our students. And of course, we've helped get those students the actual help, support, and services that they need. So before I close, I just wanted to again thank you for the opportunity to present our programming, and to let you know that our programming is available at no cost to all of your schools, and you can sign up through sandyhookpromise.org. And whether you want to bring one program or all programs, they are available in the digital form as well as through in-person presentation. And we look forward to partnering with you and to giving you more information and staying in touch. And I'll include our website in the chat box now, and it's also at the end of the presentation. Thank you so much.
Hey, Dean. Sorry to interrupt you. It looks like you just have to activate your mute button there.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Thank you.
I work with my colleagues Sarah and Frank on this project, something that's very important to us, and I was taken by the comments of my colleagues today, so I'm going to be very short and wrap up and turn it back over. We are very grateful to OJJDP for the Justice Department and the COPS Office and NIJ, and we're very grateful to be partnering with the Sandy Hook Promise. These are great people to be working with. And something that continues to strike me as schools begins in my community this week, that these are American children we're losing, and that it behooves us, it's something we just must do to learn how to intervene early and realize that this is something the whole community needs to do to get involved. Ever since April of '99 and Columbine, first Secret Service report and the FBI report and others that followed all made it clear to us that no one acts spontaneously. It's a rarity. The threat comes from the community itself, from someone in the community, that these are the opportunities we have to take advantage of to try to help each other stay safe. I think that, unfortunately, the tempo has increased. This is not a problem that seems to be going away, and that as a community we need to pull together to learn lessons best from one another so we can learn how to hopefully prevent one of these events from occurring next time. I have so much to say. I've been working on this for so long this year that I should really cut my comments short to allow us to wrap up in the proper time, but I'm grateful to have over 400 people participating in this. I think it only shows how much we all care, how much we care about our American children, how much we want to see what we can learn from one another to stop the violence. Thank you all. I'm going to turn it back over to Frank.
And Frank, just remember to unmute yourself. Thank you very much.
We have about 5 minutes left. If folks want to ask questions through the chat, we'll be happy to answer them. Thank you.
And while people are submitting their questions in the chat, thank you all for joining us. Just wanted to let everyone know that any questions that we are unable to reach for today, we will follow up post-webinar. But do please continue to submit your questions into the chat pod. Okay, looks like we had maybe just a few questions that have come in, and so let me check in with Frank and with Sarah to see. There's some questions that have come in. Are there any particular questions in the next few minutes that we wanted to possibly answer before we adjourn?
This is Frank. I did see one question. Someone asked if there's a cost for participating in the Averted School Violence Database. There is not. It is free. It is currently funded by the Department of Justice. So we encourage you to send in incidents. It is only through a large number of incidents that we can learn and share the lessons learned with the community.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Frank, for that. And just a reminder to everyone that the website to where you can access the website that Frank mentioned is on the presentation that's located, both displayed on Adobe Connect and through the Handouts pod. Just remember to simply click on the Handouts pod, click on the file name, select download, and you will have immediate access to the handouts there, which also includes the websites that were mentioned during today's presentation. So we have about a minute left, and I did want to just give enough time to give some kudos out. So thank you all so much for joining us. Again, the email addresses that you all see currently on the screen is where you're able to reach out to or even contact our presenters for today's webinar. Also remember that if you would like to follow up with any other additional questions related to the webinar, that you can contact us at OJJDP NTTAC. If you would like to visit us or even sign up for any other additional webinars or know about other webinars that we have coming up in the future, you can sign up through OJJDP's NTTAC listserv, and also visit us on Facebook as well for most up-to-date information regarding our webinars. If you would like to reach out to OJJDP, you can reach OJJDP's Help Desk at the information that's displayed on this slide. Don't forget that this webinar, including other webinars from the past, are available on OJJDP NTTAC's YouTube page as well. This is information here on the slide is where you can reach or find our YouTube page, as well as how you can contact us for any other supporting materials related to the webinar. If everyone could, please take a few minutes to read and view this disclaimer here on this slide. And finally, the last thing, please take a few minutes to go ahead and fill out our evaluation. This evaluation will help us to have feedback so that we can make any future webinars and trainers better for you all. And just a reminder for individuals, this recording will be available in about a week on the YouTube page, on OJJDP's NTTAC YouTube page. Again, thank you all for joining us for today's webinar. Thank you to our hosts and our presenters. You all have a wonderful afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us today. Take care.